Greetings, comrades! During the late 20th and early 21st century, the Olympic Games definitely became the global attention-grabbing event. It was definitely true in 1980, when the Olympics were decided to be held in a socialist country for the first time. I can talk about the 1980 Olympics for hours, so today we are not going to talk about the games itself, but rather about what was around them, about how it was affected by politics and the boycott of Western countries, or about its symbol Misha, who became the most recognizable mascot of the Olympics and made the world take a second look at the stereotype of the fearsome Russian bear. And of course about one more thing, the most little known and surprising. Why, right up to the very beginning of the Olympics, the head of the USSR and the top KGB officers together with him were pondering, maybe to hell with the whole damn thing.
Объявляю Олимпийские игры 1980 года.
Sounds rather paradoxical, don't you think? I mean, what are the Olympics? For athletes, it's a lifelong goal. For the spectators, it's a grand festival. For the host countries, first of all, it's an opportunity. For some, it's an opportunity to demonstrate their might to the world. For some, it is an opportunity to organize another huge public celebration. For some, it's an opportunity to attract tourists or develop infrastructure. And for some reason, the Soviet Union wanted to voluntarily deprive itself of all this. But look at it from the other side. Let's take France. You are Macron. You have your own fall in popularity, economic problems, anti-migrant sentiments, a government crisis with the dissolution of the parliament after all. And then there's the Olympics. The world's eyes are on Paris, yes, but is this attention positive? Religious and political scandals, strikes, athletes complaining about food transportation and beds, people pressuring you to swim in the dirty Seine, and so on. If it's not one thing, it's another. Leonid Brezhnev thought much the same way in the mid-1970s. He saw the Olympics as a huge headache and a potential source of many problems. I think it's no secret that the statement "keep politics out of sports" has nothing to do with reality. The Olympics is the most politicized event you can think of, well, maybe after Eurovision. But it wasn't the USSR or the US that first came up with the idea of using the Olympics as a political manifesto. The first to do so was, well, of course, this guy. And in the Cold War context, the Olympics became the perfect propaganda weapon for both communist and capitalist sides. Let them see how we've built a country where everything belongs to people. No, let them see that we have everything people could ever wish for. That is why the idea of the games in Moscow has been floating around since the time of Khrushchev, but it did not materialize into anything substantial at that time. In the bid for the 1980 games, everything worked out well, largely thanks to Eduard von Falz-Fein, head of the Olympic Committee of Liechtenstein, who before the vote personally tried to persuade each of the IOC members to vote for Moscow. He had Russian roots and was desperate to visit his homeland once again, even if it was already Soviet. Over the next 6 years, the entire infrastructure for the Olympics had to be built – stadiums, hotels, roads, training grounds and much more. But when the work was just starting, General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev suddenly began to question the expediency of the event. At least, this is confirmed by the memoirs of some Politburo members, such as Anatoly Chernyaev, deputy head of the International Department of the CPSU Central Committee. What kind of fool suggested organizing it in 1980 in Moscow? It's stupid! We'll throw away a lot of money, but why should we do it? Kosygin is so excited, and it doesn't occur to him that apart from a few anti-Soviet scandals, we will gain nothing from these Olympics. Of course, we shouldn't outright refuse tomorrow. It is necessary to choose a convenient moment, to prepare propagandistically, but we must cancel the Olympics for sure. According to historians, there could be several reasons for this speech. First, in 1976, Brezhnev already had health problems, and he was afraid to take on such a responsibility. Second, after the first calculations, he was horrified by the true costs involved. The country's budget was already skewed in favor of the military-industrial complex, and unforeseen spending on such an event could lead to an economic catastrophe for the country. By the way, in the end, the cost of the Olympics turned out to be twice as much as anticipated. And finally, yes, he was afraid of provocations, because any mistake in organizing or conducting competitions, or even just some unpleasant story from the real Soviet life, all this would be in every newspaper around the world the very next day, and every blunder would be seen as a failure of the communist idea itself. He was echoed by the KGB. After the tragedy at the Munich Olympics, the special services seriously wondered whether they would be able to provide security for all athletes and guests, and for their Politburo members. Especially since in 1977 there was a series of explosions arranged by Armenian nationalists. Explosions in the center of Moscow, unimaginable. The main concern was tourists. They all had to be housed, fed and protected somehow. Under the guise of tourists, Western security services could easily infiltrate their agents. How do you control a city of 8 million people, where there could be thousands of hostile elements among hundreds of thousands of foreigners? Brezhnev was firmly determined to cancel the games by paying a fine to the International Olympic Committee. However, leading party ideologist Mikhail Suslov persuaded the General Secretary not to bring the issue to a Politburo meeting. And what is most paradoxical, Brezhnev finally came to terms with the event only after he found out that the capitalist countries decided to boycott the Olympics. The ongoing Cold War could not but bring its own adjustments. For example, it came as a surprise to many in the USSR that the host country was obliged to invite all states regardless of their sympathies. The Politburo flatly refused to invite representatives of Chile, South Korea and Israel, with whom there were no diplomatic relations. But it turned out that for this, Moscow could simply be deprived of the games. And while Brezhnev might have been happy about that inwardly, he didn't want it to be like this. If he was to cancel the Moscow Games, it would have to be on his own terms. Again, the boycott saved him from a difficult choice. By the way, do you think the 1980 Olympics was the first that some country boycotted solely for political reasons? No. The first to be hit was Australia in 1956. The Netherlands, Spain and Switzerland refused to participate. The countries were protesting the Soviet invasion of Hungary and so didn't come to Melbourne. Was the logic in that? I don't know. Well, and Egypt, which was supported by Iraq, Lebanon and Cambodia, refused because of the Suez Crisis. But the UK was involved there, which is sort of connected to Australia, so it's kinda understandable. Formally, the Western countries' decision to boycott the Moscow Olympics was due to the fact that the Soviet Union treacherously invaded the sovereign country of Afghanistan. I'm absolutely not justifying the fact that the USSR decided to directly intervene in the conflict. But it's always worth remembering that any civil war is a story where there's no good and bad sides. I just want to mention a couple of facts about the very Afghan resistance that heroically fought against the superior forces of the evil communists. You know, those guys who were called freedom fighters in the Western press. They were radical Islamists. And all the leaders of the current Taliban, by the way recognized as a terrorist organization in Russia and Canada for example, but not in the US, are from the very same freedom fighters who were supported, trained and financed by the US. You can Google Operation Cyclone. And this young man, by the way, was their ally in this. So, December 1978. Despite the UN General Assembly's majority condemning the Soviet troops' entry into Afghanistan, the IOC emergency session did not vote to deny Moscow the right to host the Summer Games. Then US President Jimmy Carter said that free athletes from free countries should not go to the USSR and demanded that Moscow withdraw Soviet troops from Afghanistan within a month. This did not happen. The US call to boycott the Olympics was supported by most Islamic countries, part of Western Europe and Latin America, and Canada, Japan, South Korea, and China, but everything is quite clear here. They could not figure out whose communism was better. As a result, athletes from only 80 countries, the smallest number since 1956, traveled to the Soviet Union. The athletes, by the way, were not at all happy about these boycotts. For example, a collective lawsuit was even filed in the US against the US Olympic Committee by 25 athletes led by rower Anita DeFrance. It was not only sports teams that did not come. Following them, thousands of tourists refused to travel to Moscow. Wow Intourist reported the return of hundreds of thousands of tickets for all competitions in practically all countries. The US government even banned the Olympics 80 on national television, as a result of which NBC lost $75 million. But all this was nothing compared to the loss of sponsoring companies and partners. Ignatiy Novikov, head of the organizing committee of the Moscow Olympics, later emphasized many times that out of dozens of foreign partners, only the West German Adidas fulfilled its obligations fully and completely. But still, the boycott was not total. More than 1,000 athletes from 16 countries that officially boycotted the Games came to the Olympics in the Soviet Union. European governments were more liberal than American ones and did not threaten their athletes with revocation of citizenship as Jimmy Carter had promised to do. Athletes from 14 countries came to compete under the white IOC flag with 5 rings: the British, the French, the Australians, the Dutch. Judo fighter Ezio Gamba specifically resigned from the Italian armed forces to be able to come and won gold. Even the Americans were formally there, as many as 3. They were representatives of the Puerto Rican national team, 3 lightweight boxers, but they did not reach the medals. Among those who were preparing to ignore the Games was the West Germany. However, until the last moment, the USSR was trying to rectify the situation and tip the scales in its favor. In particular, before the visit of German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt to Moscow, the Politburo discussed the idea of gaining the politician's loyalty at an unheard-of price, giving him a Niva car, a masterpiece of the domestic automobile industry. The German Der Spiegel even quoted Brezhnev's words from a memo. He will definitely like it, because he has a summer house on the coast near Kiel, and the roads there are not particularly good. Moreover, Mr. Schmidt's wife drives a car and studies marsh plants. It did not help. The FRG still boycotted the Games. However, even the boycott of Western countries did not prevent the USSR from holding a spectacular and memorable festival. It was largely thanks to him, to Misha. Moscow coped with the difficulties and still managed to hold the Games without major scandals and problems. Hundreds of thousands of people from all over the world flew to Moscow, and instead of the popularized stereotype of a people's prison, they found themselves in a clean, exemplary city. Of course, it took enormous efforts to present the Union in the best light. The city had to be seriously cleaned up. All unreliable elements, former criminals, prostitutes and homeless people had to be evicted beyond the famous 101st kilometer. Entry to the city for the Olympics was restricted to non-residents, students were sent to kolkhozes for summer practice, school children were sent to pioneer camps at the sea, and parents of little children were hinted that provocations are possible in the city and therefore it would be better for you to go to your babushka's village for a month's rest. They also had to flood Moscow with an unprecedented variety of all kinds of foodstuffs, many of which the residents of the capital have never even seen before the Games. But the absence of scandals and delicious food is not what can make the Olympics memorable. The Olympics in the USSR is memorable, of course, for its scale, which was manifested in everything, from the new Moscow district specially built for the Olympics to the impeccable opening and closing ceremonies. And the main star was, of course, him, the official mascot of the Olympics, Mikhail Potapych Toptygin, aka Mishka, invented by the children's fairy tale illustrator Viktor Chizhikov. The choice now seems obvious: Moscow, Russia, bear. But it was not so obvious then. The bear had to go through a contest where his competitors were mostly characters from fairy tales and folklore: Konек-Gorбунок, Matryoshka and Petrushka. Mishka was a rather controversial candidate, a rather audacious attempt to contrast the good Mishka with the caricature of the evil Russian bear from Western propaganda. In addition, many thought it could be perceived as a rather friendly but still a caricature of Leonid Brezhnev, who resembled a bear in some ways. And yet the organizers and the IOC took a liking to him. The bear was dressed in a belt of Olympic rings and he was everywhere. On pennants and posters, on postage stamps, envelopes and postcards, on badges and souvenirs. He even traveled into space. And people liked him so much that he became popular even before the Olympics. His charisma was really revealed by Soviet animation directors, who made him the hero of numerous cartoons. But he became a star of the screen not only in the USSR. In 1979, the anime Kaguma no Misha came out in Japan, about the adventures of a bear cub in a big city. But the mascot definitely made history thanks to the grand closing ceremony of the Olympics. According to the organizers' plan, the Olympic bear was supposed to fly high into the sky during the closing ceremony. But how to do it? The idea was indeed extremely risky, because Misha had no right to fail in front of the whole world at the first Olympics in a socialist country. It could not burst at the seams at the most crucial moment, collapse on the stands, or cause any other trouble during an exemplary holiday. In April 1979, a group of scientists was assigned the task of lifting the mascot into the air. Mishka was not just supposed to fly vertically upwards over the stadium. Having reached a certain height, 3.5 meters from the upper edge of the stands, it had to leave the stadium as soon as possible without hitting the ball with the Olympic flame. Initially, Mishka didn't want to fly properly and was constantly tumbling in the air, because it didn't have the right aerodynamic shape. To solve this problem, it was necessary to put weight on the bear's lower legs and to tie special carrying balls on top. Moving in a certain way, the balls contributed to the displacement of the center of gravity of Mishka, which in turn allowed to control the direction of flight with a sufficient degree of accuracy. And yes, contrary to the urban legends that have spread, there was helium inside the suit, not some guy who piloted the bear and then ejected. And no one in the suit was burned in the Olympic fire at the rehearsal, and the police did not chase the flying bear around the city shooting it down with machine guns, and Mishka didn't even destroy a beer stall when he landed. By the way, initially the officials did not like the final launch of the Olympic bear. Marat Gramov, deputy head of the propaganda department of the CPSU Central Committee, listened to the organizers and put a resolution: redo it. Bears don't fly. It even seemed to some that this flight would be reminiscent of the Ascension of Christ. But the organizers went higher, to the same Suslov, the country's chief ideologist, who approved the project. Everything went smoothly at the closing ceremony. Bear floated out of the middle of the Luzhniki Stadium, grasping multicolored balloons at the very end of the closing ceremony, while Lev Lещенко and Tatiana Antsiferova were singing the song Goodbye Moscow. The bear waved goodbye with its paw and began to rise slowly above the arena before disappearing into the night sky. At that moment, a tear slowly rolled down the cheek of his twin brother, who was on the live panel on one stand. But the bear's tears, which have become legendary, were not intended and were accidental. The pieces were held by soldiers, and once, during one of the long rehearsals, a guy sitting behind Mishka's eye dozed off and forgot to turn his piece. And Lev Nemchik, who was directing the performance, began to order, such and such row, such and such place, turn your piece. There was a hiccup and the pieces were turned over by several people at once. Nemchik commanded stop and asked to repeat, and then he saw that during the step-by-step flipping of the pieces from top to bottom, it looks like a tear forming on Bear's face. The idea turned out to be ingenious. All that was left was to work out the timing, which was done. Foreign and Soviet spectators who filled the Luzhniki stands to capacity could not hold back their tears either. The image of the cruel bear, which embodied the USSR in the West, was destroyed. In the early 80s, it seemed like for good. The Moscow Olympics forever changed the way the planet Earth thought about the Olympic Games. Until 1980, the opening and closing ceremonies seemed like a simple routine, a parade of countries and flags, an audio-visual press release. How many people came, how many countries are participating, how many people made a welcoming speech, and so on. But the Soviet Union managed to impress the world by creating a gigantic open-air art performance. Without the Olympic bear flying into the sky, perhaps we would not have seen the Barcelona song by Freddie Mercury and Montserrat Caballé in 1992, the show in Sydney 2000, James Bond and the Queen in London 2012. And yes, the absence of many of the leading countries has marred the festivities, but only slightly. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, please consider leaving a like and a comment. After all, my original plan was to pick one main topic rather than 3. And as always, a huge shout out to my biggest supporters: Елизавета Zakharova, Kirill Klimuk, Zeman Böse, Jimmy Elben, Petr Ilich and Bruce Etternick. See you guys next time.